So, to kick us off here, let's start with the basics. What are quantum dots and why do we call them quantum dots?
Sure. So quantum dots are really, really small crystals, and that's something that we can make in the lab. And they have properties that are a lot like semiconductors, but because of their small size, we can control those properties. Semiconductors, you can often think of them as being able to absorb and emit light of specific wavelengths. And what's special about quantum dots is that you can control which wavelengths they absorb and emit from by their physical size.
Right.
So by really small, that's something on the order of 1 to 10 nanometers usually.
Wow.
I usually like to give some sort of example of what that means in the real world. So a human hair is something like 100 microns in diameter. So you can imagine that quantum dots are something like 10,000 of them would stack in the width of a human hair.
Oh my gosh.
They're really, really small materials.
Yeah. I'm just curious if you knew like where they got this name quantum dots. It makes them sound like this very cool and like mystical material.
They are very cool and mystical. So a lot of the properties arise from quantum mechanical concepts. So that's where the concept of quantum dot comes from. So
Sure.
The way in which the wavelength is modified as a function of the size has to do with the quantum mechanical properties of the material itself.
Okay, great. And, you had mentioned they're generally semiconductor materials, but like specifically, what are quantum dots typically made of?
Sure. So quantum dots have been being worked on for about 30 years now. And a lot of the original syntheses focused on, I guess, cadmium and zinc and lead chalcogenide materials. So those are cadmium selenide, cadmium telluride. So a lot of the original work was based on those materials. Since then, there have been a lot of new materials that have been introduced to the world that we can make now in the lab. So these are some of the 3,5 semiconductors like indium phosphide, and then even some more recent materials classes like perovskite crystals, which are more ionic, can actually precipitate out of solution at room temperature. Just that the longer the field continues, the more materials we have access to and we can make chemically in the lab.
Right. That end up falling under this broad family of quantum dots, broadly speaking. Sure. Yeah. Very cool. Okay.
With continued innovation, that'll lead to maybe more various applications or potentially just more improved performance in these applications. And so I really just wanted to discuss that with you. What are some of the potential applications for quantum dots in various sectors of the industry?
So I guess obviously we're focused in displays, and that's primarily because these materials emit wavelengths of very specific light and color. So it's a really powerful property to have if you're looking at displays, but that control over wavelength is useful to a lot of other different applications as well. So some of the early uses of quantum dots was actually in solar cells. So semiconducting materials in general are used in solar cells because they can absorb light from the solar spectrum, and that light can be converted into electricity. Quantum dots are usually created in solution, and you can actually maintain solubility in these liquid solutions. So in addition to having semiconducting properties, you can also treat them as an ink or a liquid. So you can move them around and make films out of them and print them and do roll-to-roll transfers. So that was really an exciting application in terms of the solar cell field. In addition to solar cells, there are a lot of other different applications that you can use them for. So biological tagging and imaging is another really important aspect of this. So being able to have quantum dots with specific taggants linked to particular areas of a cell, you can actually identify different regions by which color they're emitting when you go back and you look at the images. Those are some of the main original classes of applications for quantum dots, but there are a lot of new potential fields as well. So people are talking more and more about smart windows and smart lighting. So being able to control specifically which wavelengths of light can either come in through a window or which wavelengths of light are emitted from indoor lighting that we use.
Wow.
Can we talk about like why that's important? So, with these potential new smart windows, what is the importance of like dictating which wavelengths can go in and out?
Sure. So I guess if you're talking about really large buildings, being able to control which wavelengths of light could help you to control the interior temperature. There are also more advanced applications that you could imagine where you could actually have some of those wavelengths directed outwards to the edges of the windows and then collected in some sort of useful concept like a solar cell. So it's not just a filter, but it's more of an active conversion of that energy from something that would have been wasted and useless if it's just heating a building that you didn't want heated,
right,
but actually converted into electricity in some sort of application.
So you're implying that we potentially have solar windows in our future, like solar panel windows in our future.
It's a possibility, yes.
It's a possibility. Yeah. Okay, cool. And besides the prospects of solar windows and all these novel applications, based on your experience working in this field, what makes you passionate about working on these quantum dot technologies day to day?
Sure. So I guess my first introduction to quantum dots was when I was actually an undergrad in college. And sort of the first image a lot of people see of these quantum dots are little vials of glowing colors across the rainbow. And honestly, that was really captivating to me to know that something is not only technically an interesting material to work on, but is also physically beautiful. And I think that beauty of quantum dots also translates to the displays that they're in, right? So humans are definitely spending more and more of their time in front of these displays, and it's the way we interact with the world largely. So to have those images be more realistic and more vivid and capture more of what we actually see in the world is really important. So I think that's a really exciting application of these materials.
Yeah. No, we definitely saw that same demo like through our undergrad careers as well as MSc. I think that one of the times we were supposed to like do the demonstration on it properly, they had like some malfunction with like their lab facility. So they ended up sending us a bunch of pictures afterwards. We were like, okay, that's still cool. But yes, I'm looking forward to seeing more from it, certainly in those curriculum moving forward.
I just wanted to dive into those scientific principles, really. What fundamental scientific principles that govern the unique ways that quantum dots behave?
Sure. So I guess a lot of people encounter the concept of the particle in a box in introductory quantum mechanics. So I guess that's if you take a wave and you sort of compress the space in which it can exist, the amplitude of the energy of that wave goes up. So that's a concept that applies to quantum dots. So you can imagine in an atom, you have orbitals where your electrons normally exist. And similarly, in a semiconducting material, all of those atomic orbitals build up into larger continuous band structures. And the electrons and the holes in your system exist in a certain space in the material. And that space is usually something on the order of, say, 5 to 50 nanometers. So if you take the crystals and you actually make them physically smaller than that space in which your excited state would normally live in the material, you're confining the space that the wave function can take up, and you can modify its energy that way.
So that's how you're able to modify the color just based on the size of the quantum dot, right? Or correct me if I'm wrong, but if you make those slight variations in the size, you kind of mess with the extent to which you're confining it, and that changes the energy in turn.
Yeah, exactly. That's the most fundamental aspect of how these quantum dots behave. But then there are a lot of more advanced methods and technologies that we use to actually build them up to be functional materials, right? So if you imagine just taking this material and making it small, you can control the wave function, but you've taken something that used to be a very large crystal and now it's small. So a lot of the atoms of your crystal are now actually sitting on the surface and they don't have the same coordination chemistry that they used to have. They used to have some number of near neighbors and be bonded to all of those. And now if you imagine you've cut this crystal into a very small chunk, some of those atoms no longer have those near neighbors, right? So there are a lot of aspects of what to do about that to make the material useful. So specifically, you could combine multiple layers of materials together. That's a really common concept in emissive quantum dots. So people talk about core shell quantum dots. And the concept is usually that you create your core wavelength by controlling the size of your base semiconductor. And then you can grow additional layers on the outside of that of something that's a wider bandgap semiconductor material. So you can essentially create a larger crystal. So your surface is now further away, but your excited state only lives in your core.